16 million people alive today carry the DNA of one man, Genghis Khan. But this isn't a story of legacy or greatness. It's a story of systematic rape on a scale history has never seen before or since. Hundreds of thousands of women torn from their families, reduced to property, forced to bear children for their conquerors. Their names are lost, their voices silenced, but their descendants live on, carrying genetic evidence of the largest crime against women in human history. This is the truth they don't teach you. What Genghis Khan did to his slaves goes beyond typical wartime brutality. These were calculated acts designed to break human spirits, terrorize populations, and satisfy insatiable appetites for power. From sexual exploitation that left a genetic mark on millions, to using humans as shields, to forcing families to commit unspeakable acts, the Mongol treatment of slaves reveals how easily humans become objects when power goes unchecked. What follows is disturbing but essential history. The Mongol army has just conquered another Central Asian city. Smoke rises from burning buildings as soldiers move systematically through streets, searching house by house. They're not looking for treasure. They're looking for women. Every female from adolescence to old age is rounded up, separated from screaming family members, assessed like livestock. It doesn't matter if they're young girls or grandmothers. They are all property now. Women are herded into the city square, hands bound, futures decided by men who see them as war prizes. Mothers clutch daughters, trying to shield them, but they're torn apart. The pleas for mercy echo through empty streets. No one answers. These women are no longer people, they are commodities, to be distributed among victorious warriors. This scene repeated itself across 2 continents for decades. Genghis Khan's systematic sexual exploitation was one of history's most extensive crimes, yet it's often glossed over. Historical accounts detail that he possessed hundreds of wives and concubines, the overwhelming majority forcibly taken from conquered territories. This wasn't marriage, it was ownership. But Genghis Khan didn't keep this privilege to himself. He institutionalized sexual violence by granting his sons, generals, and warriors explicit rights to claim women from conquered lands. This created a military culture where rape wasn't just tolerated, it was rewarded. Victory meant access to women's bodies. The more successful a warrior, the more women he could claim. No woman was safe based on age, status, or religion. Princesses were seized alongside peasants. Elderly women and young girls faced the same fate. In Persian territories, Muslim women were violated. In Christian lands, nuns were dragged from convents. The Mongols were equal opportunity rapists, respecting no cultural boundaries. The psychological trauma compounded physical violation. Women weren't just raped, they were uprooted from everything they knew. Torn from families, forced to bear children to their rapists, knowing those children would grow up as Mongols with no connection to their mother's heritage. Some watched their husbands and sons killed before being taken. The grief and trauma these women carried was immense and lifelong. Genghis Khan also treated women as diplomatic currency, exchanging enslaved women as gifts to cement political alliances. A woman might be seized from Persia, given as tribute to a Central Asian ruler, then traded to a Chinese merchant. With each transaction, her identity erased. She became less a person and more an object. The Khan fathered enormous numbers of children with his countless victims. Kublai Khan, who established the Yuan dynasty in China, was his grandson through union with a Tangut princess whose name we don't even know. She had no choice in bearing a child who would become emperor. She was simply another vessel for spreading Genghis Khan's bloodline. The true scale remained hidden until modern genetics revealed it. A groundbreaking study discovered that approximately 16 million men alive today, about 0.5% of the world's entire male population, can trace their direct paternal lineage back to Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. This represents the largest known genetic legacy of any individual in human history. Think about what this means. 16 million people today carry the genetic signature of systematic sexual violence committed 8 centuries ago. Each represents an unbroken line of male descendants stretching back to women who were conquered, enslaved, and raped. This isn't abstract history, it's living testament to sexual exploitation on an unprecedented scale. But Y chromosome studies only track male lineages, making women invisible in this genetic narrative, just as they were erased from historical records. The matrilineal descendants of enslaved women likely number in the hundreds of millions, but they don't appear in studies about Genghis Khan's genetic legacy. Even centuries later, these women remain erased. We don't know most of their names. We don't know their stories, hopes, or dreams before Mongol conquest destroyed their lives. History recorded the Khan's victories, but the women forced to bear his sons left almost no trace. They were nameless then and remain nameless now. Some women chose death over this fate. Historical accounts mention women who committed suicide when Mongol armies approached. Others killed their daughters to spare them. In repeatedly raided regions, families hid their women when scouts were spotted, sometimes in such desperate circumstances that women suffocated in concealed spaces. But sexual exploitation was only one weapon in Genghis Khan's arsenal. His treatment of male slaves was equally brutal, turning human beings into expendable military equipment. 30,000 Chinese soldiers stand at the front of Genghis Khan's advancing forces near Xisha in 1209, but they're not marching willingly. They're captives, chained together, forced to walk toward their own countrymen's defenses. They can see their capital's walls ahead, see their fellow soldiers preparing to defend it, and they know what's coming. The first arrow volley darkens the sky. The human shields have no armor, no weapons, nowhere to run. Arrows punch through bodies with wet thuds. Men scream, fall, are trampled by those behind them still being pushed forward by Mongol spears. Blood soaks the earth. Defenders on the walls face an impossible choice: stop shooting and let Mongols advance unopposed, or continue firing and kill their own people. This wasn't battlefield chaos, it was calculated strategy. Genghis Khan systematically used human shields across his conquests, forcing captives to march at the head of his advancing army, creating a living barrier to absorb enemy defensive fire. The physical protection was significant. Arrows that would have killed experienced warriors instead killed expendable captives. But the psychological impact was even more devastating. Defenders watching their own countrymen being slaughtered by their arrows often broke ranks or surrendered. Those who continued firing were traumatized, their morale shattered. Genghis Khan understood that breaking an enemy's will was often more valuable than breaking their defenses. During the 1223 campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan refined this tactic to even more grotesque extremes. Thousands of Muslim captives served as human shields, but some suffered worse. They were tied to siege equipment and literally launched into enemy fortifications like living projectiles. Imagine being strapped to a catapult, feeling the mechanism tension, knowing that in moments you'll be hurled toward stone walls. The terror must have been absolute. These weren't isolated incidents, this was standard Mongol procedure, documented across multiple campaigns. The use of human shields became so associated with Mongol warfare that the mere threat caused some cities to surrender immediately. Defenders couldn't bear watching their own people weaponized against them. Being used as a human shield meant quick death compared to the prolonged suffering awaiting slaves, forced into brutal labor and degrading blood sports. Thousands of slaves dig irrigation canals under the brutal Central Asian sun, their backs permanently bent, hands bleeding through calluses. Mongol overseers watch from horseback, whips ready. There's no rest, no mercy. When slaves collapse from exhaustion, they're dragged aside and left to die. Fresh captives replace them within hours. The work never stops. The forced labor was backbreaking, endless, designed to break both body and spirit. They dug canals, built roads, carried supplies across impossible distances. This wasn't just economic exploitation, it was subjugation through exhaustion, ensuring slaves lacked strength or will to resist. Tasks were often deliberately degrading. Slaves might be forced to build monuments celebrating their own people's defeat, or construct fortifications to be used against their homelands. The psychological impact of contributing to your own civilization's destruction was devastating. Some slaves gave up, refusing food, choosing slow death over continued complicity. But physical labor wasn't the worst fate. Genghis Khan and his generals developed appetite for blood, sport, entertainment that transformed human suffering into spectacle. Slaves were forced to fight each other in brutal combat, while Mongol warriors watched, drank, and placed bets. Picture the scene. Mongol warriors in a circle, passing fermented mare's milk, laughing. In the center, Two slaves face each other with crude weapons. They don't want to fight, perhaps they're friends from the same village. But Mongol whips crack. The rule is simple: fight until one of you is dead, or we kill you both slowly. The fights are savage, desperate, without honor, just terrified people trying to survive while their captors treat it as comedy. Even more horrifying were spectacles involving wild animals. Slaves were thrown into pens with wolves, bears, or wild dogs, forced to fight with no weapons. These weren't quick deaths. Animals would maul victims for extended periods, their screams part of the entertainment. Some slaves were deliberately wounded first to make them easier prey and prolong the spectacle. These blood sports served multiple purposes. They dehumanized victims, created constant fear among slaves, and provided psychological conditioning for Mongol warriors, normalizing violence and making battlefield atrocities easier to commit. When Mongol armies occupied cities, they often staged these sports publicly, forcing local populations to watch as warnings. Yet, even these physical horrors pale beside the psychological torture Genghis Khan perfected, forcing slaves to commit acts so unspeakable they would shatter the human soul beyond repair. The siege of Otrar in 1219 has ended. Genghis Khan stands in the governor's palace as soldiers drag two men before him, the governor and his son. The Khan's ambassadors were murdered here, an insult demanding unprecedented retribution. But simple execution isn't enough. He orders the son's chains removed and a sword placed in his hands. The young man looks confused, then horrified as he realizes what's being demanded. "Kill your father." The words hang like poison. The governor begs his son not to do it, to die with honor. Mongol warriors surround them, swords drawn. The threat is clear: obey or both die slowly. The son's hands shake as he raises the blade. What follows is butchery inexperienced, hesitant, making it worse. When the father finally dies, the son drops the sword, falls to his knees, and Mongol blades flash. Both bodies are left in the courtyard as a warning. This wasn't spontaneous rage, it was calculated psychological warfare. Genghis Khan understood that the most effective way to break a person's spirit wasn't physical torture, but forcing them to betray their deepest values. By making slaves kill their own family members, he demonstrated absolute power, shattered victims' sense of self, and created traumatized survivors who would never recover. A tortured person might eventually heal and resist again, but a person forced to murder their own child or parent? That person is broken forever. They carry guilt and shame that never heals. They become perfect slaves too, psychologically destroyed to resist, serving as living warnings to others. During the siege of Nishapur in 1221, this tactic reached unprecedented horror. The city had killed Tokchar, the Khan's favorite son-in-law. When it fell, Genghis Khan ordered a massacre of unparalleled brutality. Every living creature must die. Men, women, children, even animals. The streets ran red for days. But before the massacre began, he forced his own daughter, Tokchar's widow, to witness the entire slaughter. She was positioned where she couldn't look away, as tens of thousands were systematically butchered. Children were executed before parents. Families were slaughtered together. Persian historians record that soldiers built pyramids from victims' skulls, afterwards separate pyramids for men, women, and children. An entire city transformed into monuments of death. Why force his daughter to watch? It was his way of sharing the burden of grief. If he had lost someone precious, she must witness what that loss cost. Others must carry those images forever. The psychological damage inflicted on her is impossible to comprehend. Other slaves faced similar impossible choices. Fathers were forced to choose which children would live and which would die. Mothers were forced to watch their daughters raped, threatened if they looked away. Brothers were forced to torture brothers to death. These weren't spontaneous cruelty, they were calculated policies designed to break human spirits so completely that resistance became psychologically impossible. The long-term effects were catastrophic. Many went mad or committed suicide. Even survivors were forever changed, carrying trauma that passed through generations. These interconnected horrors all served a single purpose: building and maintaining the largest land empire in history through systematic application of absolute terror. The shocking truth about Genghis Khan's slaves reveals fundamental patterns about unchecked power. From systematic sexual exploitation leaving a genetic mark on millions, to human shields, brutal labor, blood sports, and psychological torture, all these horrors shared a common thread. They transformed humans into objects, reducing people to tools and commodities for those with power over them. What makes these atrocities particularly disturbing is their effectiveness. Genghis Khan's tactics worked. Cities surrendered without fighting. Vast territories were controlled by small occupation forces because terror made rebellion psychologically impossible. The human shield saved Mongol lives. The forced labor built lasting infrastructure. The sexual exploitation spread his genetic legacy across continents measurably. From a purely strategic standpoint, his methods achieved their objectives completely. That's perhaps the most uncomfortable truth. Systematic cruelty worked. But at what cost? 40 million lives destroyed, tens of millions enslaved, their humanity stolen, their suffering erased from history, entire civilizations wiped from existence. The genetic legacy of 16 million descendants represents 16 million unbroken lines of suffering, each tracing back to a woman whose name we'll never know, whose autonomy was stolen, whose pain built an empire. As we confront this history, we must resist dismissing it as simply how things were back then, a reflex that denies the full humanity of victims. We must also avoid viewing it as completely alien to our modern world, creating comfortable distance that prevents us from seeing contemporary parallels. Both responses allow us to avoid uncomfortable questions about power, dehumanization, and complicity that remain relevant today. The patterns Genghis Khan employed using sexual violence as a weapon of war, treating populations as expendable, breaking spirits through psychological torture, building systems on enslaved labor didn't end with the Mongol Empire. They've recurred throughout history, and elements persist today. Recognizing these patterns in historical cases helps us identify and resist them in contemporary situations. 16 million people carry genetic evidence of these crimes in their DNA. A reminder that history isn't abstract, it lives in our bodies, our genes, our inherited traumas. Every one of those 16 million descends from a woman whose story was erased, whose suffering was forgotten, whose humanity was denied. Remembering them, speaking their truth, even without their names, is an act of historical justice, however incomplete. The shocking truth about Genghis Khan's slaves isn't just about one empire. It's about what humans become capable of when power goes unchecked, when groups are dehumanized, when violence becomes systematic policy. Understanding this history doesn't just teach us about the past, it challenges us to examine our present and shape our future with clearer eyes and stronger commitments to human dignity for all people.
This artifact proves they were here.